Jenny Harry Hindmarsh is the clinical, the research coordinator down there, and she was our project lead there. We had 98 patients in Auckland, 48 in counties, and 25, so 100 in Uawa, so 171 patients in total, and it is the biggest project we've had so far in New Zealand. If anyone's got any questions, just stick your hand up and I'm happy to answer them. So the project's purpose was to help more people with long-term conditions continue to live well at home through the use of telecare. We had 7 research questions. I won't bore you going through all those, but I can provide information later. But the 3 that I think were most important, and the primary questions we were trying to answer by undertaking this was, would telecare decrease hospital attendance and admissions into hospital? Would it improve patient understanding of their condition and support patient self-management? And would it provide an economically more efficient means for the person, family and whānau, providers and funding agencies to manage a person's long-term condition? So I had some beautiful slides which showed what the little tool looked like, but it's, you just have to go. I'm going to do my best to paint this picture, so excuse me if I don't. I'm sure many of you remember a wee while back, Nintendo devices. I think they're a thing of the past now, little handheld things. And basically the device that we selected looked something like that. It was provided by a UK-based company called Docobo after a very long and arduous RFP process. We had the clinical people involved in that process leading that forum, and we were constrained by our funding. So we had, I think, well over 30, pretty close to 40 applications respond to the RFP, which we found pretty overwhelming, and a lot of them were cut out from the get-go due to cost. So I think that's always an issue in the New Zealand context. It's not like money's going to suddenly appear. So that's always something to be mindful of. We also chose something, the only solution that was a manually based solution. Most of them use web-enabled technologies. You stood on the scales and the data was sucked up into the internet. The reason we chose a manual system was A, it was cheaper, and B, there is some belief that if a patient actually is involved in that process of saying, okay, 88 kilos, good, I'll type in 88 kilos into this little device, that journey that the patient undertakes actually enhances their understanding about, well, maybe if I didn't eat that yesterday, I wouldn't be 88 kilos today, I might be 85. So we were just trying to test if that was actually true. Patients were, depending on the disease that they were being monitored for, they, as well as a handheld device, in their home we gave them a set of scales and or a blood pressure machine, a little oxygen saturation thing which they put on their finger to measure their oxygen sats, and down in Ngāti Pro they were the only team that used those, the blood glucose monitors. So every morning the patient would wake up and there'd be a little message saying, "Good morning, John, time to answer your questions," and they'd go through this little process, plug their answers into the machine, and we used dial-up broadband, so using a POTS line, because down in Tolaga Bay at that point in time there was no broadband. You got about 5 minutes out of Gisborne and you went into the black hole. So we wanted to make sure that everyone used the same technology. That is improving down there now. Stop me if you need to, Ernie. And they go through that process and the data would be transmitted through. The 3 different clinical teams all had access to a web-enabled page that showed them their patient data, pretty much like a traffic light system. Patients and clinicians sat down and worked out what their parameters were that they needed to be within, and when those parameters were exceeded, alerts were triggered in the system. So if you looked at the patient screen, you'd see your 48 patients. If you saw all green blobs, you knew everything was well. If you saw amber, you knew people were creeping up to being in trouble, and if you saw red, you knew that immediate action needed to be undertaken, or an intervention. Pretty much it allowed very targeted use of resource to look at the people that needed help the most, and just to let people get on with their life who didn't need assistance. And they could drill down into that data and see what was going on, and nurses or doctors or specialists could contact the patient and interact with the patient whatever way they needed to ensure that they were well. So I'm not talking about clinical key findings today, but the questionnaires is that people undertook, they did them at baseline when they started the trial, 3 months or thereabouts when they still had the equipment in their home. So they used it for about 3 months, some 4 months, some down in Tolaga Bay longer. And then again, they sat the same questionnaire at 6 months. It took about an hour to complete, and it was very much about the specific disease, but then more general things like depression, anxiety, and self-efficacy. And we also asked some questions about telecare, which is not surprising. And last night I was just going through some of the data and just thought I'd pull out 3 pertinent things that I thought were really relevant, and showed the real desire that consumers have for wanting home telecare. I think this was pretty surprising. Would you pay to have this equipment at home? 3 of the houses I went to in Tolaga Bay or in the outskirts turned off their fridges because they couldn't afford power, but some of these people are the ones that responded to say that they would pay for telecare, so I think that's interesting. 77% said they would pay to have this equipment in their home, and only 23% said they wouldn't. I think that sort of speaks volumes for a consumer. How much would you be prepared to pay per month? Thinking that most people would be on a phone plan, maybe $20 a month, say. We picked up to 25, up to 50 and up to 100. 74% would be prepared to pay up to $25 a month to use it, and 22% up to $50 per month. I think that's, again, you know, we want to pay for this, we want it so much. I mean, that's pretty crazy. Another thing we wanted to know is how much time each day patients use the equipment for, because we didn't want it to be this onerous burden in their life. Up to 15 minutes, up to 30 minutes, more than 30 minutes. Thankfully, no one chose the more than 30 minutes, which we're really pleased about. 87% said it took them less than 15 minutes, and 13% said up to half an hour. So really a small part of their day, and just became very routine for them. Just wrapping up very quickly, I've got one story when I went out to Middlemore Hospital, and some of the nurses out there in the respiratory team are very senior, and I remember I turned up and I could just see them thinking, what's this blondie going to tell us we're going to do here? And one particular nurse said to me, Sarah, it's never going to work. Never. I can tell you now, it's never going to work. But I persisted with this presentation with David Bopping at the time, and I would say that that particular nurse, she's now, I've seen her in press, I've seen her on TV. She is the biggest advocate for home telecare that I can ever think of. She was able to see 4 times the amount of patients that she saw before she started home telecare, and she felt that she knew far more detail about every patient because she could monitor their results daily. So to see 4 times the amount of patients is phenomenal. I mean, it's a no-brainer that we need this stuff just on that alone. One nice quote here, I thought, just from a clinic member, I'll just read it out. I love what it does, that it draws the patient their self-awareness and responsibility for their own health. They say, you don't have to worry about my blood pressure. I've been making sure to do that. And almost informing you that you don't have to worry about it, that I'm taking care of myself, and that's what I like about it. It's very positive. So, and just a bit of feedback. As I said, the results are overwhelmingly positive, and there are negative ones too, but I'm just focusing on the positives today. One little quote to wrap up. Telecare pulls you up. This is from a patient. Telecare pulls you up as you're not the only one that's seen the results. And another one, for me, when things go wrong, I need to rely on that machine as a monitor because I can't see inside me. But those machines that you've given us have given us a better appreciation of where we're at in life. And I'll leave it there. I can come back to some of the implementation considerations and other things when we're talking about other things. But there are some lessons to
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, very positive response there. So that's the remote monitoring side of telehealth, and goodness knows how many visits to doctors that kind of program would save, as well as getting people more involved with their own health and wellness. Before I sort of open for some discussion, and then I'm going to open for discussion, then I'm going to come back to Pat and Robin at the opportune time. But coming back to my question about the last time you went to the doctor, so I have one question to put to you about your last visit to the doctor, and you've got a choice of 3 answers. Assuming that you had in your home a high-definition video screen and that the doctor had an equivalent facility, could you have conducted that consultation from the comfort of your home over a video conference line? Choice of 3 answers: no, maybe, or yes. So thinking of that particular consultation, who says no, it couldn't have been done by video? Okay, who says maybe? Who says yes? Okay, so that's quite, hold your hands up, the yeses. So it's a minority, but it's a strong minority. I'm guessing it's 30-35%. And if we could get 30 or 35% of physical consultations swapped over to even an email chat or a telephone chat or a video link, we can make a really big dent in the demands on the health system. Okay, I'm going to just open now to the floor for anyone who wants to talk about anything, as long as it's somewhat remotely related to health, to have a word. Just wait for the microphone if you would, because we got to think of our people on the web. This gentleman over here.
Thank you. Quickly on your doctor's visit, it's important to think of side consequences. Face-to-face for me works very well. But video, I can't understand what's going on. I have hearing problems. So when we look at these kind of issues, we have to consider that it's not just, oh, look, we'll set up a video link. It's great. It's not going to work for everybody, or maybe not even for a majority of people. On shared care record, it scares the crap out of me. The possibility for a doctor relying on previous history to either ignore symptoms or decide, oh well, all these avenues have been checked, so I'm not going to bother checking again, can lead to literally years of pain. And I think that we need to do a lot more thinking about the consequences of refused care based on shared care records. I like the idea in general, but it really scares me quite a bit. I've seen too many horror stories on what's going on already, that if it's open that all your records are available to doctors, I think that there's really big potential for failure.
Thank you. Comment over here.
Hi, I just wanted to answer your comment, and I do understand your concerns, but I did hear that a number of people who go to a doctor and see the doctor and are ordered a blood test end up being admitted to hospital, and the first thing they have to do is repeat the blood test, because they actually can't get the result from the community to the hospital where it's needed, and that's like 30% of all blood tests have to be repeated on admission. If we could just cut out that through being able to share the results of something like as simple like a blood test, that would be a huge saving and could be significant.
Question over here, was there? Anyone? Right in the corner.
Hi. One of the concerns that I have with some of, I think that a lot of this has really good use, but I was at a seminar a couple of months ago at the University of Auckland on big data, where what was being published was data that was gathered electronically through standard admission processes in the hospital, which of course, when one goes into hospital, one cannot be considered to reasonably have released the permission to use one's data as a research project. Although we know that a lot of that data is used for internal analysis, once that goes into a research publication, and what are the safeguards that are being put around electronic health to make sure that personal data is not being used for research without patient consent?
Yes. Very good point. You know, and some people might know, I chair a consumer panel for the National Health IT Board, which is not the capacity I'm here in, but I do that. And one or two of my panel members are here, Joe Fitzpatrick over in the corner there, and Sasha Dillon's kicking around somewhere. But so yes, and that is a very valid point. You know, how do you, the research people are really looking forward to the consolidation of all this information, because it is obviously an extremely valuable research tool in terms of public health and all kinds of medical developments. Sorry? That does not make it right. I absolutely agree. And so somehow we've got to find protocols along with the privacy one to make sure that people's privacy is protected. This gentleman here and then over there. Correct. So should people have the ability to consent case by case, or is it implicit that if you have an online health record that a DHB ethics committee or the privacy commissioner's office or someone can make that call on your behalf? And we're talking about de-identified information. Yeah. It is a big issue. Joe might have something to say about that later. I'll pass the buck.
Sorry,
Yeah.
I was just going to say that I have actually been involved in a research project as part of the Human Atlas project, and that involved a lot of de-identified data. And the thing is that because it's always stored at a de-identified level, people can be approached after the fact for consent. And I think the major ethical constraint that we had was because we were modelling heart data, that some people had actually were not available anymore to give consent, and that was our primary ethical concern, was the inavailability to give consent at all. Knowing who these people were, they'd be approached by whoever brokered the data to us, and they were only identified to us by case numbers. So de-identification can actually happen before consent, as long as it's not actually put into the research sphere. So yeah, thank you.
Who else has got their hand up? Here we are.
Kia ora, Ernie. I'm from Tauranga, and first I just want to, Sarah, well done. We currently run a mobile youth service which sends out basically a mobile doctor's clinic out into poor neighbourhoods in Tauranga, operating from 6 p.m. to about midnight, 4 nights a week. Now, a reason we got that in about 2010, I went to Alaska to look at what was ostensibly one of the best examples of a native hospital in the world. And that was really good. While I was there, they had the Chilean miners down the mine, if you recall. And when they found those miners, they threw down food, water, and they also sent down a remote suit for each of the miners, and that monitored those miners remotely. Now, that suit was made in Dunedin. So the office of that building is in Penrose. So I had a meeting with them 4 months after that and said, hey, I really dug this. I saw this on television while I was in Alaska. What do you think? And the guy said, hey, man, that's old news. And he pulled out this thing the size of an iPhone and he says, we've ditched the suit and this is what we now have. So what that means then is that, and this goes back to the point that you were making, Ernie, which was fascinating. I want my tribe, for people who are sick, to wear these things, right? And so you can remote monitor them. You get in on something like a SCOP. I know we've got all these privacy issues to deal with, but we'll get to that. I've got to have the dream first, right? So we monitor our people and say you don't need to go in a hospital. So a doc can look in her office and get out all your vital details. All of our people who are in Auckland and everywhere else around the world can hook in to a Skype type of scenario where we can have the meeting there and all the details are there. Imagine what would happen in that scenario. And that's what I really liked about what you're saying. I think and I really like what you're saying too, Sarah. I think the IT stuff has a really big role to play going forward in this country. And you look at places like in Darwin and Northern Territory where they do a lot of remote monitoring. And to the extent, say, in some of the outer reaches in Canada, where you can dial up your meds in an ATM machine, 4 hours flight away, an ATM machine pops out your meds. How amazing is that? So let's hear it up for IT anyway, that's all I can say.
In the corner, Joe.
Joe Fitzpatrick, just to clarify the research information, we did actually have the right to give our permission to have our research, our data collected for research under the Health and Disability Act, Consumer Rights Act, but that was traded away about 5 years ago to, under Rule 710B, when the Health and Disability Commissioner agreed that if an ethics committee somewhere approved the research, then there was absolutely no need to ask for permission. So you need to know that. And at the time I was working for a women's health rights group, and we kicked up a merry dance, all to no avail, because it was all done behind closed doors. So just to clarify that issue. But I think for me the difference between a frightening future and a kind of brave new world which is empowering is the involvement of consumers in all the processes. And I mean the idea of having all my vital signs monitored by a little machine becomes frightening if I have no control over where that data goes and who makes decisions about it. Becomes extraordinarily empowering if it's connected to a whole bunch of my whānau with similar conditions to me, and who I helped analyse that data to make changes to our own health and to empower and educate ourselves. And I guess working in the consumer space, the two things that I see need to be addressed to empower our futures are to get rid of the clinical preciousness around consumer involvement. You know, the number of times I've heard doctors tell me that consumer information isn't reliable, how they've got the cheek to say that when we've got so many examples of where they stuff up things. I mean, we don't, you know, chopping off wrong arms and legs, you know, I mean, then they tell us that we can't monitor our own height and weight. I find that extremely irritating. But also around getting consumers to, empowering consumers to feel as though they are partners in the process, and having a model of care that takes consumer participation seriously. And I guess I'd like some conversation around both those aspects, the clinical and health professional resistance, and the fact that we have a population that is not at all interested in being a partner in their own care or has no ways of getting into that.
Thanks, Joe. Another question here, and then I'm just going to ask Pat Kerr to speak for a minute after that.
Just one of the things that's coming to mind through this discussion is the idea of patient autonomy. So the patient being able to make the choices and decisions around what they're doing. And that seems quite problematic when you think about it, because I think I'm healthy, I feel healthy, all that kind of stuff, but the statistics or otherwise are telling me something different. So whose choice it is, and this is part of that issue. I think there are elements of opportunities in regards to gamification or ways of involving the consumer or the patient, I guess, without actually putting the wrong kind of spin on what they're doing, if that makes sense. So there's awareness about what kind of medical information you're giving out as well as how it's being used, but then there's how it's being understood is another thing. Because I could be given the direction to lose X amount of weight, for example, when that's actually not the issue. It's more about the salt content or some other medical issue. So I'd suggest there's a lot of information that we need to understand about how the behaviour of what is being used, I guess.
There are issues galore, aren't there, when you come to think of it? I mean, apart from the sole trade-off between privacy and efficiency, and how to get the best middle course and all that, there are odd things like, the more you monitor people, the more you go to identify potential medical problems, and may have the perverse effect of actually increasing demand on the health system when we're trying to reduce it. I'd just like to ask Pat Kerr to speak for a minute or two. Pat's the leading light of the Telehealth Forum, and give us a little bit of an update on just where telehealth stands in New Zealand at the moment.
Yep, thank you. And I'll ask another question following on Sarah's question. How many in the room are clinicians or have a clinical background? So a smaller proportion. So primarily consumers in that sense. Yes, I'm representing the Telehealth Forum, which was established just about a year ago. Our primary mission, and that was with the sponsorship of the National Health IT Board based in Wellington under Graham Osborne and Laurie Milner. So they recognize telehealth. The time has come, so to speak. We've been working in various telemedicine applications in New Zealand since the early 1990s. We put first video conferencing systems in Waikato back in 1993, 94. And typically what's happened over the years is that there have been many pilots, there have been many trials, and very, very few of them have ever actually resulted in a bona fide, sustainable telehealth service for any number of reasons, for relying on grant funding, perhaps to get it off the ground and not having the capital and the resources to keep it going, for not looking at the change management, because it's not about the technology. It is about the technology in a way, because we now can do so much more with our bandwidth than we did with ISDN, for example, all those years ago. But it's much more about the people that have to deliver the service. So when we talk about telehealth, one of the big success factors is the change management, and that usually isn't addressed sufficiently enough in pilots. So how do we change the services? How do we change the way that we do business and make it sustainable? And the sexy part is buying the equipment. You know, the sexy part is going through the RFPs and looking at the VC equipment and looking at the monitors and so on. That's almost an easier decision to make than it is to allocating people to the service. And people are much more than just the clinicians. So it's the coordinators and others, and the IT. You mentioned the IT. The whole ICT support for delivering telehealth services is absolutely fundamental. So the forum is really about looking at all of those things and promoting the services around New Zealand, taking advantage of the ones that are working. There's some significant progress that's been made, for example, in the South Island. There's a very large telemedicine network now operating between, we call it across the Alps, Transalpine Telemedicine between Canterbury, DHB, and the West Coast. In Canterbury, virtually all of the specialists, the tertiary specialists, are based in Christchurch and have to travel across to the West Coast, or the patients have to travel. And they're running a significant number of clinics in pediatrics, in oncology, in cardiology, and now they're now going to start doing some geriatric work, orthopedic work, so that the specialists can see the patients across on the West Coast without having to travel as often. Doesn't eliminate face-to-face, will never totally eliminate it, but it certainly improves the access. From the standpoint of access, we're also up in the Northland. Northland DHB now is running renal services between Whangarei Hospital and Kaitaia in the Bay of Islands. So the nephrologist is now seeing his patients who are on dialysis over video, and instead of having to travel 2 hours, 2.5 hours, and take the small planes, which don't always fly when they should. And he's got clinical nurse managers, and that's where the change management comes in. The nurses are taking on a much more significant role in the telehealth services if they are presenting patients at the remote end. Or the GPs. We're going to be looking at a project, we will be doing a project between Wairoa and Hastings very shortly, where the GPs will be involved at the remote end in the consultations, and it's upskilling them significantly in that regard, as well as the nurses. So it's another big area that we're looking at. Telehealth, just keep in mind that there are many, many, many definitions. So when you look at the articles and you have to be aware of what it is they're talking about. We use it in a very broad sense, the definition that includes a whole host of applications. If you look at articles from the UK and some of the vendors in New Zealand who are dealing with tele-monitoring, they call that telehealth. So there'll be a telehealth report, but when you actually start reading it, it's talking about home monitoring. So the key applications that we look at are telemedicine, and that's the interactive services using video conferencing. And we can start seeing that changing every single day. Well, the core high-end enterprise video conferencing systems, we now have doctors using iPads. One of them in Christchurch, a pediatrician, is using an iPad in his home with a very high-end video conferencing system that can get into the DHB network. So when he's on call, he can actually do ward rounds over in Greymouth from his home. And that's just within the last 6-9 months. So we weren't even looking at those sorts of things a year ago, and yet it's just changing as every week goes by. So that affects effectively is just some of the highlights of what the forum is about. We are a nexus of information. We do have a website. It's a fledgling website, I'd have to say. It's hosted by the National Health IT Board, and we will be improving that as we go to add information about case studies and so on. So if anyone wants any more information about the forum or about what we're working on, please don't hesitate. Give me your card.
Thanks, Pat. I am going to run over time because we started late because there were no microphones. So if you feel obliged to walk out, then feel free and I'll sort of get the message. There's a question over here, a comment over here. Just while you're going across there, somebody said to me the other day, why is it that when the kids who went to med school were always the smartest ones in the class, that this is the slowest sector to actually take on the challenges of the information age?
Kia ora, everyone. My name is Richard Orzeki. I sit on 2 health boards in Wanganui and Mid-Central, and we're undertaking a large central region involving 60 HBs, about a $40 million IT project to bring the shared record concept into being. With the current government's view on regionalisation, patients have to travel to secondary care hospitals because of lack of specialist care doctors. I'm always very, and again just highlighted again today with Pamela Jones-Harbour's view on privacy. When we say share, my view is not only should hospitals share the information, but patients should be part of that loop as well. So patients should be able to see what is being actually recorded and have access to that data. If they don't want something in there, they should be able to remove it, they themselves, regardless of what the clinicians may think, for their right to have that information around. Now, the thing I see in my role is the amount of waste effort that goes into recording all of this data repetitively through different hospitals. You go to one hospital, and some patients travel to 4 different hospitals to be cared for, and all those records get duplicated in each of those hospitals because there's no one record to go to. I also work with another government group called NetHui, which is around the rollout of RBI and UFB, and certainly the RBI solution, e-health. E-health is a big focus for our group for Māori actually being able to access better quality technology for their health needs. And of course, Māori like to talk face-to-face. Sometimes it's better to do a 10-minute consultation than to travel 3 hours for the same 10-minute consultation. But notwithstanding that we're all consumers and we all want our rights protected, the reality is that and just coming back from China just recently, just to see how small we are, and I met with the Ministry of Health in China and said, look, how do you look after 1.3 billion people? The reality is they don't. The other reality there is obesity is a big issue to the Chinese, and how do they actually deal with that? I mean, I was amazed to see a diabetes hospital. So the only thing they did at this hospital was treat diabetes, big sign up on the front. So, so when we're so small that we have to be smarter, I think, in terms of systems and thinking and innovation to be able to meet our needs. We have to attract, Wanganui and Mid-Central have been going through a regional women's health regional project, and 400 women might have to travel from Wanganui to Mid-Central for secondary care services. They got knocked on the head after three months of consultations with our communities. So now we have to set up, which we should have done in the first place, 2 services under one regional framework. So, it does take time for boards and clinicians to maybe listen to the public in terms of what their best options are. But what I'm saying is whatever comes out of that process, we hope that it's better than what we've got now in terms of the healthcare, and especially with our rural patients, both Māori and non-Māori, that actually have that tyranny of distance to try and cover off as well. Thank you.
Who did I see with a question over here somewhere? Yeah, there we are. No, sorry, no. Timekeeper. There we go. But you're right, we're a small country, but we actually have enough scale that we can do really good things, and we have to nail this one.
I was just going to say, as a consumer, I'm sure I'm not the only one that, when I've had symptoms, has gone on Google to have a little bit of a look at what's happening. And it's quite interesting coming along to this, because one of my friends is in England, is actually starting up an online doctor service. But it just seems to me that, yes, privacy is a concern, but on the other hand, you've got all these people out here that are using Dr. Google, and shouldn't the person on the other end of the Google actually be a doctor?
Yes. Health is the second most searched word on Google. 2.3 billion.
So, sort of related to that, I have a real interest in alternative medicine and pseudoscience. And one of the things that seems to happen is that they do really well in that they spend a lot of time with patients. And so people will go to an alternative health practitioner because they give them time. And I worry that these kind of systems, while they seem fantastic, the thought that this nurse can now see 4 times as many patients, that's terrifying to me, because if we are cutting down the amount of contact that patients have with real doctors, I don't know, is this happening? That is going to drive people more to alternative practitioners. And then if there's this shared records, actually, should they be involved too, so that you know what pills they might be getting from other places? It's just a thought.
Pat? Time for about 3 more speakers. Anyone else who hasn't spoken yet?
Yeah, I just want to clarify something I think that I may have misled on that. And when we talked about on the teleconsultations, which is the interactive, so where the patient and the clinician are in different geographic locations, where the clinical nurse is presenting the patient, that's in lieu of a patient traveling to see the specialist on their own. So the clinical nurse isn't doing any diagnosis in that particular type of consultation. They're doing them for follow-up assessments, for example, with oncology patients. So typically a patient might have to travel on the West Coast from Westport all the way down to Greymouth or across to Christchurch, or from Whangarei down to Auckland. If they can stay in their home area without having to travel, especially when they're not well. And they go into a clinic where there's a nurse who is trained to deal with them. She is actually with that patient, but the clinician, the specialist, is at the other end. So the nurse isn't making the diagnosis in that situation. So if that's what you understood from what I said before.
Sarah?
I know that this is always something like nurses seeing more patients is always a concern, and I can understand your concerns. If you knew this particular nurse, you'd know that if she thought it was putting any patient at risk in any way, shape or form, she would cease and desist immediately. All I can say is that no one likes to be seen by a doctor or a nurse unless they're really lonely. I hate going to the doctor, and I would choose not to do it. If I knew that every Thursday a nurse was going to come and see me, I'd start getting a bit resentful, actually. And if she only saw me when I was sick and really needed her help, I'd find that far more empowering. And it's in doing that this nurse is able to see more patients. So if that makes sense, it's just about addressing need rather than these routines that we've built into the hospital system are insane. Why see someone every Thursday if they don't need to be seen? It's that kind of thing. Just efficiency.
Yeah. Sarah, can you pass that mic 3 rows back, please?
Sure.
I had a question more around, from a consumer point of view, whether the data is partitioned, access to the data is partitioned in the common health record. What they're looking at in Australia particularly is that the record's only appropriate information that's been authorised by the patient is presented to any given practitioner. And also there's issues around if you like, the error bars on the diagnosis. There's issues around the authentication of the data that goes into the system. Perhaps one of our speakers could comment on those.
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and I think the way it's mostly being talked about in the New Zealand setting at the moment is the notion of off-the-record consultations. So if you're sensitive about a particular condition, then you can put that effectively in a closed envelope, and subsequent clinicians can see there's something there, but they can't see what it is. And if they think it might be relevant, they can say to you, well, do you want to tell me about what happened back in 1998? So it's one way around it, but there's, a lot of these things are still being discussed, and lots of opportunity for public debate on them.
Medication is a particularly pertinent issue. There's an assumption that many people think that you need to see the list of stuff that people are being prescribed currently so you can decide whether or not to prescribe something else. Actually, all you need to do is tell a computer what you propose to prescribe, and it can check the conflicts, assuming that information is accurate. You do not need to know that they're on
like hair regrowth medication if you're giving them a painkiller, unless there's an actual side effect between them.
Right. Okay, time for one more observation.
Thank you. Steve Lowe. Just a comment about productivity improvements. They go way beyond the hospital and the GP as a consumer. We all spend a lot of time travelling, waiting in waiting rooms, time out of the office, time out of the home. So being able to do these things from home would be a significant productivity improvement, not only for us as consumers, but also for the economy. Improvements in the transport system, we save money from driving, we save time. It doesn't need to be for everything, but there are a lot of, fairly basic things that you wander off the dock for, and I need to go and see one today. But you could do a lot of the low end stuff far more efficiently from the home, with a bit of monitoring and maybe video. But just a remote consultation has big benefits into the economy. Thanks.
And absolutely agree with that. And, I think, Steve, one of the ultimate stupidities is when we get something like swine flu or, some kind of epidemic, and all of us who think we might have it or know we've got it all go and assemble in a common place, a doctor's surgery, thereby ensuring that if we didn't have it when we arrived, we probably have it when we left. Why can't we just have a session that at 10 o'clock this morning, the doctor is going to be taking a collective group of people in their homes on a video link and talking them through and sending out medication as required. Look, we've run way out of time. This could go on for a long while. One point I will just make in wrapping up is the Health IT Board has got a series of seminars in certain parts of the country coming up on this, some in the next few weeks, and then they'll be repeated as we go along. So if you're interested in being on a mailing list for that, please just leave your details on a glass here, a business card or your email address, and I'll make sure that you're put in touch with that. So look, thank you for the participation. I think we could have gone on all afternoon, and of course there are 2 more sessions in the health stream coming up. So hopefully we'll all see each other there. Thank you very much for that participation.